Ugh. This is a video I've been putting off making for a very long time. It's not something I've ever particularly wanted to do, but I'm going to have to cover F.E.A.R 2 at some point or another. I reference the original F.E.A.R in almost every one of my videos, but I never reference F.E.A.R 2. And there's a reason for that. The general consensus is just that F.E.A.R 1 is a significantly better game than its sequel. However, not many people explain why, because people just agree, so there's no need to. However, I have to cover this game at some point, and there's no way to do that without explaining why F.E.A.R 2 is so bad compared to the original game. Hey everybody! As always, Jarek here, and if I were to make a list of the best first-person shooters of all time, F.E.A.R would be top 5, alongside greats like Doom and the original Half-Life. I think it's that good, so it's extra disappointing to me that F.E.A.R 2 ended up the way it did. What's extra frustrating about F.E.A.R 2 is that occasionally, you get glimpses, small moments of greatness, and then they quickly go away. This game could have been so great, but we ended up getting a sequel that is worse than the original game in every imaginable way, and in some ways, surprisingly worse. But before I explain why, I need to thank today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is a little more positive. Today's sponsor is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for people who like to be creative, where millions come together to learn how to improve their creative expression. Skillshare has thousands of classes for people who are creative and curious. There's topics on illustration, design, photography, videos, freelancing, and many more. So Skillshare is for people who want to learn more, who are curious, who want to pick up that hobby that they've been putting off for the last 5 years. You're not going to have that extra time for too much longer, now will be the time to get into trying out that new hobby. Skillshare has plenty of classes for all skill levels that will fit your schedule. Most are under 60 minutes, and members get unlimited access to the site. One of the most common questions I get, whether I'm streaming on Twitch or in my YouTube comments, or even just walking around in regular day-to-day life, is how did you start your YouTube channel? How did you gain and keep your followers? How did you avoid burnout? And those are some really good questions. So the Skillshare class I'm going to share with you today is YouTube Success Script, Shoot, and Edit by Marquise Brownlee. This whole class is roughly an hour long and gives a lot of good information into this career. There is a lot of learning when it comes to doing things on YouTube, but it almost always starts as you just posting your hobby or you doing what you want to do. And then it starts ballooning and you learn more and more and you just want to share your knowledge. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click that link down below in the video information will get a free trial of premium membership, so you can finally get into that hobby you've been putting off, or maybe try to even get into a new career. As always, a big thanks goes out to Skillshare. I'm always super happy to have them as a sponsor on this channel. I mean, who would be against learning? Alright, back to 2009. I picked up F.E.A.R 2 and right away something was off. I'm going to talk about the graphics, and F.E.A.R 2 looks surprisingly different than the original, despite the fact that they run on the same engine. Yes, it's been upgraded, but it's still the same engine. Now, I've always hated the statement, graphics don't matter, gameplay matters, because it's only half true. Of course, gameplay matters, but graphics 100% do matter. They set the entire tone and the aesthetic of your game. I mean, hell, I was born in '91, and I remember growing up, graphics were a huge deal because they just kept getting better and better. I mean, in the course of around a decade, we went from Quake to Half-Life 2 to Crysis. I maintain the opinion that Crysis 1 was a good game. Maybe not one of the best shooters of all time, but still a good game. However, you cannot tell me that if it didn't have the graphics that it had, it would have been anywhere near as successful. Crysis is an extreme example, but you get my point. Graphics definitely matter, and that really shows in F.E.A.R 2. Everything is so saturated in this game. There are so many bright colors everywhere. Now, I'm not saying I want the game to be brown and dull. The original F.E.A.R game didn't look that way. It definitely had color, but F.E.A.R 2 was overdoing it. To make things worse, every time you went slow motion, everything seemed to glow these bright colors. The overall look ended up being slightly cartoony as a result. But an equally large problem are the aesthetics as a whole. These designs went way over the top, which is not how the original game was. People complain a lot about the environments in F.E.A.R 1. And fair enough, for the most part you're exploring industrial complexes and offices. Pretty much the whole game is that. However, the aim for the original F.E.A.R was that it was supposed to be grounded. This seems like something that could happen in the industrial neighborhood of your home city. Nothing here pulls me out of what's going on. Even something as wild as having a bunch of replica soldiers still seems mundane, like they fit in. I mean, hell, this is a game talking about ghosts, yet in the combat encounters, you're not thinking or questioning this too much. Yet in F.E.A.R 2, for everything aside from, say, Alma, the designs have been changed entirely. There is nothing attaching F.E.A.R 2 to F.E.A.R 1 visually. Hell, for the longest time, I didn't even realize that the Armacam soldiers were Armacam. I thought they were more replica soldiers. Are you trying to tell me that these little ATC security guys suddenly are now super soldiers and have mechs that fall out of the sky? F.E.A.R 1, you could suspend your disbelief. Despite the fact that the story was kind of over the top, the presentation was very mundane. F.E.A.R 2 right away gets rid of that. If this was all I had to complain about and the gameplay was still top-notch, I would totally forget it, but that's unfortunately not the case. Keep in mind, the graphics are bonus points for me. If you have an ugly-looking game, but with great gameplay, I'm gonna just forgive the graphics entirely. Rainbow Six Vegas is a great example. That game looked terrible even on launch, but it still remains one of my favorite games because the gameplay is so good. It would have gotten a few extra points if the graphics were Crysis or something, but it doesn't necessarily need it. But it also doesn't have the problem of aesthetics dragging you out of the game, so perhaps that's a moot point. Vegas 2 also doesn't look worse than Vegas 1, so again, it's a moot point. In case you forgot, the original F.E.A.R was one of the best looking games up until around Crysis released. And yeah, it had high-res textures that looked good, but the thing that really sold it for most people were the crazy over-the-top particle effects and the damn good lighting. A lot of the lighting is baked in, but it's believable. However, the lighting that really stood out were all the harsh shadows. These were real time, and for 2005, they were mind-blowing. Whether you realize it or not, the human brain is very good at picking out good and bad lighting. If something is off with the lighting, even if you can't point out what it is, you definitely know, and that's the case I had with F.E.A.R 2. All this lighting just looks flat. I'm not sure what's going on here, but it doesn't seem anywhere near as dynamic as the original game. I can't even give credit to F.E.A.R 2 for fixing a problem that F.E.A.R 1 had with every environment looking the same, because Extraction Point, a F.E.A.R 1 expansion, already fixed that. Hell, F.E.A.R 2 even ripped some of the scenes directly out of Extraction Point.
Sergeant, thank God. Guessing Chin didn't make it. Shit.
The second one is in Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. I just don't have any good footage of Extraction Point, so I use Perseus Mandate, but you get the point. All this makes the story that much more disappointing to me. Well, not actually the story of F.E.A.R 2, more the fact that they just retconned Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate and said that they're not canon. I reject your canon and I substitute my own. I made a full video on this, click up there if you want to see that. I covered the original F.E.A.R and Extraction Point. Extraction Point to me is the true end to the F.E.A.R franchise. I'm going to be talking about spoilers. I assume if you've clicked this video, you already know everything about F.E.A.R 1 and 2 and you're just here for the conversation, but you know, spoiler warning just in case. Extraction Point starts off right where F.E.A.R ended, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Your team needs to get to the extraction point. Getting there is a living hell, and in the process, one team member after another ends up getting killed by supernatural forces. Also, Alma managed to bring back F.E.A.R, so now you got replica soldiers to deal with too. Even you come surprisingly close to death in the hospital section at the end of the game. And this section is one of the reasons why I want people to play F.E.A.R so badly. This is the best horror segment in the entire franchise, and it just keeps going. The horror in Extraction Point is definitely done a lot better than the base game. Anyway, the game ends with even your team lead being shot down out of a helicopter and dying, while F.E.A.R and the replica soldiers destroy the city. The quote-unquote good guys lost, while Alma and F.E.A.R are getting their retribution. To me, this is the best way F.E.A.R could have ended. It's not a happy story, this is dark. But F.E.A.R 2 takes that and just chucks it out the window and says it never happened. Okay, I get it. I know why they did this. Extraction Point was not made by Monolith. It was outsourced to Timegate, and they have to make a sequel somehow. They can't just have the end of the game. But I don't even agree with that, because you can build an endless struggle with Paxton and Alma in the following games. I don't expect them to do this, but I'm still disappointed. Anyway, with that all said, the story is probably the thing I can complain about the least in F.E.A.R 2. Not the presentation, I can complain about that a lot, but the story itself, it's basically an awkward middle game setting up a sequel that Monolith never ended up making. It got outsourced to somebody else instead. Well, not even outsourced, it just got given to an entirely new developer. You play as a Delta Force operator, Michael Beckett. Your squad is sent in to capture Genevieve Aristide, a suit gone rogue. She's one of the people largely responsible for Alma and the entire messed up situation you're in. However, this takes place right at the end of the original F.E.A.R, and you're interrupted by that gigantic nuke going off. I'm not gonna lie, aside from the camera zooming in and out for seemingly no reason that F.E.A.R loves to do, seeing this explosion from a different perspective is actually kind of awesome. But afterward, you're captured and turned into their own little experiment. This explains your slow motion capabilities, but unfortunately, it's attracting Alma to you. To be entirely honest, nothing happens from this point on to the end of the game. It more or less just retells the story that you already figured out in F.E.A.R 1. I am, however, going to defend the end of the game as I don't have too much of a problem with it. I'm not going to show it or really state explicitly what happened because this video will get demonetized instantly. But if you're watching this video, you probably already know what I'm talking about here. Well, Alma and the main character get it on against the best of your wishes, hopefully. And now Alma is pregnant, setting up the third game. What Alma wants to do with this child is up to your own imagination. No one really knew at this point. She could want this child to be the Antichrist. Who knows? Personally, I'm fine with that. That being the narrative of the story doesn't really bother me. The middle part of trilogies generally ends up being kind of empty with not a whole lot happening. So if that was just setting up the third game, that's fine. That said, my biggest problem with the story is 1, how the story is explained to you, and 2, the writing. Let's start with the presentation. In the original F.E.A.R, most of the story is explained to you through voicemails that you would find as you wander along. Now, this isn't groundbreaking or fantastic, but it does allow for some great atmospheric storytelling. This allows the player to find the story beats at his own pace. No cutscene being forced to you, just what the player is seeing and hearing. But it also keeps the player in the moment. These are real people leaving real voicemails. You were never brought out of this world at any given time. The whole big picture of just how messed up the experiment with Alma is slowly revealed to the player, and when it suddenly clicks in the player's head, that's when you realize what you're really in for. Now, the presentation of the story in F.E.A.R 1 is not perfect either, and it could have been improved, but I'm also not really complaining because of what I've already mentioned. F.E.A.R 2 doesn't do any of this right. Those voicemails are replaced with things to read, which I can't be arsed to bother, and most of the story beats are just presented to you through cutscenes. This is where number 2 comes in. This writing is atrocious.
I grabbed it from the experimental weapons lab when the shit started flying. Which reminds me, have you ever seen a hippopotamus fight? They start crapping and wagging their tails really fast and shit just flies everywhere. It's f***ing insane.
Get me inside the old nuclear reactor.
No, I didn't add in that music or those voice clips. That's genuinely in the game. The tone of F.E.A.R 2 is all over the place. I don't know what it's trying to tell me. The atmosphere looks like it's supposed to be dark and scary and spooky, although it never quite gets scary. I'll get to that. But the writing makes me believe that every character wants to be in a frat party or something. This doesn't make me feel like I'm in Delta Force after a giant nuke went off. It makes me feel like I'm with my best buds pranking Alma. But now we get to the real important part, the gameplay. And what really hurts about this one is that I remember playing the F.E.A.R 2 demo and being floored. The combat was super satisfying, the scary parts were suitably scary. This looked like the true demo to the game I loved. Then the game came out. F.E.A.R 1 came out in 2005. F.E.A.R 2 came out in 2009. 2005 was a very different era when it comes to first-person shooters than 2009. And F.E.A.R 2 added in all those quote-unquote improvements that we got in shooters over the years. Thankfully, it did not go full Call of Duty, but it did take in a few elements from it. They added iron sights and the asthma sprinting, neither of which I feel needed to be added in F.E.A.R. Let's talk about the iron sights first, because they're easier to explain. This seems like it would be an objective upgrade, but it's not. In the original F.E.A.R, you just did this little zoom. Hipfire was still very accurate though, and the zoom didn't give you that much more accuracy, so for the most part, you could just run and gun your entire way through. It also took very little time to zoom and wouldn't get in your way. It felt like hipfire, or very slightly more accurate hipfire. With the addition of aim down sights, this has to be changed. Now, hipfire is very inaccurate, but aim down sights is accurate. The result is that you're going to be shoving your face into your gun for most of the game. This slows things down dramatically. It also just takes up more of the screen. This becomes the optimal way to play the game, and that's inherently less fun. Next up came sprinting. Now in the original F.E.A.R, there was no sprint, so you always ran at a jogging pace. This was faster than walking, but slower than sprinting. Either way, it never felt like I was too slow or too fast. But more importantly, this also made the jump kicking and slide kicking feel fluid. This felt like your momentum from running went directly into that kick. None of this is true in F.E.A.R 2. The walking speed is now just slower, and you can't sprint for very long. This also makes jump kicking feel really awkward. Not only do the animations look somewhat worse, but it just doesn't transition smoothly. It doesn't feel like my momentum from my run is going into that kick. Oh, also the melee system got butchered and just doesn't work anymore. Look at this shit. Look at this. How does this miss? Look at this melee. Look at how bad the melee in this game is. It makes me so disappointed. What? Why did he do that? Jump kicking used to be a viable thing you can do in F.E.A.R 1. If you were caught reloading as someone turned the corner, damn well you're going to be jump kicking. That is super effective. And then when you hit them, they're going to go flying across the room. In F.E.A.R 2, even if you do kill them, you just kind of phase through them. I found slide kicking to be a lot more effective. Ignoring the fact that they changed the controls, in F.E.A.R 1 you pressed crouch and melee to slide kick, in F.E.A.R 2 you sprint in melee, which is weird. But slide kicking is a lot more effective. But once again, it doesn't feel like you even hit them, they just kind of fall over. Oh, also, both games have the standing in place roundhouse kick. This is rarely effective and you almost never want to do them in either game. Especially F.E.A.R 2, because it just doesn't hit them. I do think this shows off what's really happening though. I think the hitboxes were made a lot tighter in F.E.A.R 2. This sucks in first person because in first person you can't really see how far you are from an enemy. So oftentimes, your foot may not really be hitting them, but it damn well looks like it is. In F.E.A.R 1, the kicking was generous, but not too generous. It was something someone could do for the first time, immediately understand how it works, and implement it into their game. In F.E.A.R 2, you probably tried to jump kick someone, it didn't work, and then you gave up. The original F.E.A.R was based on John Woo movies, and when the melee system like this is not working, that sucks. You may be saying, okay, well just slide kick them now. If that works, why complain? Well, one, as I said, is nowhere near as satisfying, and two, this makes the melee system nowhere near as deep as it used to be. You may think you would always jump in F.E.A.R 1, but that's not exactly the case. For example, if you were in a higher location, slide kicking was the better option to do than jump kicking. This led to a lot of fun in F.E.A.R Combat, which is F.E.A.R 1's multiplayer. I would get into a server with a bunch of friends and do melee-only matches. It was almost deep enough to be its own game. It was a lot of fun. Also, the grenades were killer, which is something I cannot say about F.E.A.R 2. In F.E.A.R 2, they added the ability to cook grenades. You may think this would be an objective improvement, but it's not. The grenades are so much worse than they were in the first game. Cooking grenades is nice, but the big downgrade comes with the fact that grenades no longer blow up on contact, which sucks. F.E.A.R 1 grenades were round and would roll wherever you needed them to. It was so easy to bank them off a wall and then hit an opponent and it would blow up on contact, making this huge explosion of blood. It was awesome. In F.E.A.R 2, you just cook the grenade. It's like any other shooter. It's not satisfying at all, and you have to sit there and wait while it's happening. That is not conducive to an active gunfight. There was never a time in F.E.A.R 2 where you would be actively in a gunfight wanting to throw a grenade at someone. That would result in you wanting to sit behind cover while you're cooking the grenade, then pop up and throw it. In F.E.A.R 2, you could just stop shooting and peg him in the face with the grenade. But I guess this is a good segue to the weapons, because they all feel worse than the first game. In the first game, all of the weapons were usable at any given moment. They all also had these awesome particle effects that caused explosions and the whole environment to tear apart. Shooting enemies had that ripping paper noise. It was so much more satisfying than it needed to be. The pistols are a great example of a downgrade. In F.E.A.R 1, the pistols felt like a primary. You could dual wield them and they were really effective. In F.E.A.R 2, the pistol is... yeah, you're never going to want to use this thing. You can't even dual wield it. The moment you get it, you're just gonna use something else instead and then drop it. Speaking of downgrades, let's talk about the shotgun. F.E.A.R 1 shotgun is up there with the Doom Super Shotgun for the best shotgun in first-person shooter history. It is legendary. This pump action feels incredibly weak comparatively. It can still occasionally turn people that are point blank into a bloody mist, but these effects are nowhere near as good as they used to be. In F.E.A.R 1, it was just that. It was a bloody mist with gibs flying out in every direction. In F.E.A.R 2, the blood looks like glowing jelly. This just looks bad, though it is apparently powerful enough to still trigger the crazy ragdoll glitches that happen in this game's engine. It went through the wall! The animation also doesn't look like you're pumping it at all. For a while, I thought it was semi-automatic. So yeah, that shotgun's a big downgrade. You do get a semi-automatic shotgun later on that is admittingly pretty good, but nowhere near as good as the shotgun in the first game. F.E.A.R 2 might also have the worst flamethrower I have seen in video game history. He survived! In fact, pretty much every gun in the game got this downgrade treatment. They sound weaker, they don't feel as satisfying, the game just isn't as fun. There's only one gun that I thought got better, and that was the quote-unquote penetrator in the first game, which is now the hammerhead. This thing does actually sound great, and having people ragdoll and pin to the closest wall is still pretty awesome. That said, it was also pretty awesome in the first game. There are some more interesting weapons, like for example this laser weapon that for some reason points to the top left of your screen instead of the middle. I don't know why it functions like this, it's real annoying. It also was worse than the laser gun we had in Extraction Point, and then they added their own little BFG. Yep, that's just a BFG. There was something else I was disappointed by, and no one seems to mention this, probably because no one played the multiplayer, but there were some guns in the multiplayer that we never got to use in the single player. For example, the ASP rifle, which is nice to see come back because almost nothing else does, and it's interesting to see it have an actual reload animation. But no one played the multiplayer and no one got a chance to use it in the single player. I'll take an extra moment to emphasize that almost nothing came back from the first game. Nothing visually ties this game to the first game. No weapons, the enemies look totally different. This game is supposed to take place at the same time as F.E.A.R 1. How did this happen? Did a nuke just change everything? Did I get it thrown into another timeline? How is this working? But I saved the most damning thing for last. The enemy AI. The AI in F.E.A.R 1 is something of legend. In F.E.A.R 2 it feels so stupid in every way. Yeah, this also happened where it would just regularly break. So what made F.E.A.R 1's AI feel so smart? Well, it was a combination of genuinely good AI and good map design. The original F.E.A.R was a linear game, yes, but every time you got into combat, that combat arena was more like a multiplayer map. This gave the enemy AI so many different things to do. They could try to pin you down firing at your position while one of them tries to flank from behind. They could retreat on their own firing back at you. They could knock things over for cover. They had so many different paths with so many different actions that they could do. Now this on its own felt nice, but the real trick is that the enemy AI were always talking to each other. These enemies were never alone, and when you got into a combat arena, they didn't just pour out of a doorway, they were already there. Even better, if you got the drop on them, they would die in one shot no matter where you shot them. This would automatically alert the other ones and they would kind of scatter. They also didn't blindly rush the player. It wasn't too infrequent where you would have a stalemate and no one would be shooting. They would just be holding position. As I mentioned, the AI is always talking to each other. This does two things. One, it makes the world feel more real. It makes these enemies feel more like people instead of just AI. And two, it gives more information back to the player. For example, say there is a squad of 4. You take 3 of them out so there's 1 left. You will hear that last guy say something along the lines of, that tells you he's the only one left and he's also expressing panic. This dynamic of having a squad already there to take on inhabiting the world is so much more enjoyable than just having enemies pour in through a door. And that's exactly what F.E.A.R 2 does. I've always referred to this as clown closets. You've probably heard me call it that in the past. Well, F.E.A.R 2 not only has a horrible problem with this, but the map design does not allow the AI to really go anywhere. No longer do you have these big combat arenas to actually fight the enemies. For all I know, the enemy AI could be the same as the first game, but they never get to show it off. Since they have nowhere to go, most of the time they just rush straight at you, you activate slow motion while hiding behind cover, shoot all of them by shoving your gun into your face and aiming down sights, and the combat is over. Almost every single combat encounter is going to play out this way. And it's so disappointing compared to how the first game was. To make things worse, the difficulty modes are terrible. Normal is beyond easy, and hard can be really dumb. On hard mode, everything is exactly the same, but occasionally you'll just kind of randomly get one shot. It doesn't feel more challenging, it just feels cheap. Oh my lord. That's hard mode. Hard mode just kills you. I had full health and armor, by the way. Again, this is worse than the original game, which had easy, normal, hard, and extreme difficulty modes. One of my complaints about the original game is that it still feels a little too easy on extreme, but at least you're not randomly getting one shot from stupid things. What makes all of this so much worse is that F.E.A.R 2 occasionally shows moments of brilliance, what feels like the original game, and then it goes back to what it was. Typically, when you think of a game, your emotions on the first part of that game that pops into your head is what dictates whether you like it or want to replay it or not. For example, if I think of Halo Combat Evolved and the first thing that pops up into my head is the library, I might think it's the worst game ever and never want to play it again. But if instead the first thing that pops into my head is the Silent Cartographer, I may think it's one of the best games ever and maybe even overrated a little bit. I think this is the case with F.E.A.R 2 when people defend it. They're thinking specifically of the elementary school level. And this part is indeed a lot more like the original F.E.A.R and is better than the rest of the game. They're doing something with the lighting again. They're actually trying to make an atmosphere. The horror in F.E.A.R 1 was all about building up a tense atmosphere to scare the player. The hospital section in Extraction Point, I think, is the peak of that horror. Well, the horror in F.E.A.R 2 is turn everything brown while you do a QuickTime event. I'm sorry, Alma popping out at me is not scary, and QuickTime events aren't fun. Why are they here? And for that matter, cutscenes are not scary either. Generally, when the game wants you to for sure know that somebody is about to get killed in a horrible way by Alma, it's in a cutscene. Taking the control away from the player, turning everything brown, and murdering someone is not scary. What's confusing about this is that Extraction Point did this so much better and never took the control away from the player. It set a thick atmosphere and murdered someone horribly. Well, during this elementary school part, they actually did this. Well, not the murdering someone, but they actually set an atmosphere. They're actually doing something with the lighting. This feels more like the horror sections in the original F.E.A.R, which the rest of the game simply didn't do. They also added this ghost enemy, which reminds me of those invisible red glowing eye types in Extraction Point, and while they're not quite as good, they're still nice to add in some tension. You can be attacked from any direction. It's dark, you can't see much, you gotta be on edge. They did, however, actually improve the ninjas. Now, the atmosphere isn't quite there like in F.E.A.R 1. When you first come across these things, they scared you shitless because they could attack you from anywhere. However, once you realize that you could just kick them, they're kind of a non-issue. F.E.A.R 2 fixed this problem by making them electric. You can't kick them now, otherwise you'll get shocked. This turned things around. Once you realize you can kick the ninjas in F.E.A.R 1, you feel like the hunter. But in F.E.A.R 2, you always feel like you're being hunted. You want to keep your distance away from these enemies. Unfortunately, while these enemies had potential to be great, the atmosphere isn't quite thick enough for them to really be fantastic, but they did try. And the last new enemy I want to talk about are the puppeteers. I don't know if that's their actual name, but that's what I'm gonna call them. You first see one as a businessman still trying to hail a cab. Presumably that was something he did every day of his life. Well, now he does exactly what you think a puppeteer would do. He reanimates the dead. He even has these orange strings to go to the reanimated. You want to take these guys out as soon as possible so they'll stop reviving enemies. It's an interesting new opponent, and I don't even mind that they don't show up that much because they feel like mini-bosses. However, I do think they could have done more. Every single fight is more or less the same. They never show up with any other enemies nearby. So it quickly turns into just go slow motion and kill them before they can really do anything and then move on. I kind of just described all of F.E.A.R. You know what I'm saying. Anyway, I think you get my point. There are a few moments that stand out, and if this game was as good as those moments, it would have been a worthy sequel. But instead, it was worse in every single way. And that's without mentioning the technical problems I had. Now, the PC port has most of your basics. You can change all your settings as you want. Unfortunately, you can't access the advanced settings once you're in game, which is stupid as hell, but you can change it in the main menu. This includes being able to turn out the film grain because thank God that film grain looks terrible. However, it fumbled in other really dumb ways. For starters, there's no FOV slider, but the FOV by default is fine, so I can't complain too much. But the bigger issue is the mouse aim, which feels awful. Even at its lowest setting, the mouse aim is way too sensitive. I had to turn my DPI down to 550 just so I could aim. But that doesn't fix everything. It's got an odd dead zone where things are slower then suddenly speeds up. It also has mouse acceleration, which you can't turn off. There is a fix online that's supposed to give you raw input. I did notice I could get correct sensitivity with this, but it added so many other worse issues. Now your aim floats after you stop moving your mouse and then suddenly snaps in place. It's impossible to play like this, so I just had to deal with the weird mouse aim. Another bizarre problem is that your extra mouse buttons don't work in this game. There is a quote-unquote fix, but that fix is to download a program that rebinds some of the keys on your keyboard to mouse button 4 and 5, and that's bullshit. That is not a fix. It doesn't even make sense as to why these wouldn't work. It's not thought gaming mice were new. Hell, these buttons worked in the original F.E.A.R. So you can't blame it on being an old game. It's not a DOS game. It came out in 2009. I also found out that if you turn down the in-game audio, which I did for a little while because I was streaming and wanted my stream to be able to hear me, this royally breaks the audio. Turning down the audio, not all the way, just a little bit so it's slightly quieter, means you won't be able to hear enemies at distance, you won't be able to hear gunfire at distance, explosions won't play at all. It breaks the audio in its entirety. I don't know how they managed to do this, but it's baffling as a mess up. I also had a few bugs where the textures didn't load, but I'm chalking this up to playing this on a new computer for a game that's 11 years old now. The other problems though have nothing to do with that. That happened on old hardware too. So yeah, when the world disappeared, one of those times was during a sniper mission and I couldn't tell if the snipers were behind cover or not. I restarted the game and it fixed it, thank God. But the other time this happened was when I was scaling a cliff. I got a ways and then fell to my death. When I reloaded, the world came back. Here's how far I managed to get while not being able to see anything. When I jumped forward to my death, if I had instead just taken a few steps backward, I would have triggered the loading for the next level. Somehow I would have gotten through all of this. Gamers are just built different. Boy, this video is gonna be longer than my other videos. I think you get what I'm saying at this point. F.E.A.R 2 was a massive disappointment, and I think I can end the video here. I will eventually cover the expansion for F.E.A.R 2 because it was more fun. I also still need to cover Perseus Mandate, which was less fun. And eventually I will cover F.E.A.R 3. I'll cover the whole franchise at one point or another. I want to give a huge thanks to everyone that joined me over on Twitch while I stream this game. My Twitch is twitch.tv/JarekTheGamingDragon. If you subscribe to my Twitch, you get to see my videos ahead of time. And as always, I want to give a thanks to my sponsors, Skillshare. Again, the first 1,000 people to click that link down below get a free trial of premium membership. As always, a big thanks goes to all of you guys for watching this video. This is definitely one of my bigger projects, and man, it's something I put up for a long time, so I hope you have enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.